The three-tiered cake stood untouched. 40 chairs sat empty. And Celeste Kingsley, the wheelchair-bound CEO of a billion-dollar mobility empire, waited at the center of the Halston Grand's 37th floor dining room, while no one came. When the manager moved to clear the table, a broad-shouldered black man in a faded denim shirt, Owen Carver, a carpenter repairing a door down the hall, pulled out 2 chairs and asked, "Would you mind if we sat with you?" He did not know that question had just made him a target. Stay until the end, to see why those 2 chairs were enough to shake an empire. The Halston Grand occupied 37 floors above the financial district of a major American city, and its rooftop restaurant was considered one of the most exclusive venues in the state, the kind of place where a reservation required a waiting list and a name that meant something in the right circles. Celeste Kingsley had not reserved a table for the evening. She had rented the entire private dining room. The space swept along a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking a glittering skyline. Draped in white linen and set with 40-place settings that gleamed under warm chandelier light, the flowers were fresh white orchids flown in from a small grower in Hawaii. The wine had come from a Napa vineyard that produced fewer than 2,000 bottles a year. The three-tiered cake, vanilla sponge layered with dark chocolate ganache, had been ordered from a pastry chef, whose pricing required a separate conversation. The chandelier above the long table held 48 tapered crystal arms and threw soft amber pools across the cloth. A string quartet had been booked for the second hour and had been quietly dismissed at the door when the room remained empty past the agreed start time. The skyline beyond the glass moved through the slow color changes of evening, and the silence inside the room thickened with each shift in the light. Celeste, 38 years old that evening, sat in her wheelchair with her back straight and her posture composed the way she had trained herself to sit through every board meeting since the accident 18 months earlier. She had checked her phone what felt like 90 times in the past 90 minutes. The last message from her assistant had cited unusually heavy traffic near the bridge. She had nodded once, set the phone down, and understood the silence for what it was. Her cousin Everett Kingsley had not come. Her closest friend, Veronica Ashford, had not come. 3 board members she had personally invited had not come. She had built a career on reading patterns, in market data, in engineering specifications, in the body language of people who smiled at her while waiting for her to fail. The pattern of 40 empty chairs on the night of her 38th birthday read with unmistakable clarity. The accident had taken the use of her legs. She had fought her way back to the conference table, with the same discipline she had applied to every other problem in her life. But the people who had once feared her had learned, in her absence, how to organize their distance. Owen Carver was not supposed to be on that floor at all. He was a carpenter who restored high-end interior woodwork for a small list of long-standing clients, and the Halston Grand had asked him to come in that evening to plane down a warped oak door at the entrance to the private corridor. He had brought his 8-year-old daughter Avery with him, planning to finish the repair in under an hour and take her to dinner afterward. As he pushed his rolling tool cart down the carpeted hallway, 2 white waiters near the service station glanced at him from his work boots to his denim shirt and turned away without a greeting. One of them murmured something to the other under his breath, half a smirk at the corner of his mouth. It was a look Owen had grown familiar with over many years of working inside buildings, where a man like him was only expected to appear in the role of someone fixing something. The concierge at the front desk had taken twice as long to verify his work order as she had taken for the gentleman in the cashmere coat ahead of him, and she had asked him twice whether the contractor he was billing under was aware he had been sent. He had answered both times without changing his expression. Avery walked beside him, her 2 braids swinging against her red backpack, and she did not notice the waiters at all. Owen was kneeling beside the doorframe with a hand plane and a strip of sandpaper when the soft clink of crystal being lifted off a tablecloth drifted through the gap in the doorway. He paused. There was a particular cadence to service staff removing items that had outlasted their purpose, an unhurried, almost apologetic rhythm, and something in the sound made him set the plane down and look up. He glanced through the narrow opening without intending to, and he saw her, a woman in a wheelchair, alone at the center of a long table set for 40. Her back straight, her expression carefully arranged into something that was trying very hard not to be devastation. He took in the untouched cake, the unlit candles, the orchids still upright in their slender glass vases, and the way the manager hovered near the side door, waiting for the polite signal to begin clearing. He took in the silence around her. The kind of silence that wraps a room when 40 people have decided in unison not to arrive, and he understood it the way a carpenter understands a joint that has been loaded for years in the wrong direction. He did not knock. He did not calculate the distance between their worlds. He did not consider what a woman like Celeste Kingsley might think of a man like him walking uninvited into her evening. He stepped through the door, crossed to the nearest empty seats, and pulled out 2 chairs, one for himself and one for Avery. He set them across from Celeste, close enough that she would have to look at him, and asked simply, "Would you mind if we sat with you?" Avery stood just behind him with her jacket still on, and her eyes wide with the quiet understanding that comes from watching a parent follow an instinct too clear to question. She did not speak. She waited. She had grown up around her father's careful, attentive silences, and had learned that they were the prelude to him doing something kind. Celeste studied him the way she studied everything that arrived without warning, with attention and suspicion in equal measure. She told him plainly that she had not asked for company and did not need anyone's pity. Owen answered that he was not offering pity. He said his daughter had a weakness for good ganache, and it would be a shame to let 3 tiers of what appeared to be an excellent cake go to waste on an empty room. He said it without flourish, the way he might have said that a door swung true or a joint had settled. There was no performance in it. There was no negotiation. Avery, without being asked, sat down. She pulled a small plate toward herself, looked at the bottom tier with the seriousness of a child who took dessert seriously, and asked Celeste which flavor it was, as though the answer mattered very much. She also asked whether the flowers had been picked or grown, because she had a science project on plants and had been trying to tell the difference. The question was so ordinary, so entirely unaware of the weight of the evening, that Celeste's composure slipped for just a moment, and then, quietly and unexpectedly, she laughed. It was not the polished laugh she used in boardrooms to signal warmth without vulnerability. It was real and a little startled, the laugh of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be treated like a person at a birthday party rather than a problem to be managed. She answered Avery's question. She told her the bottom tier was lemon curd, and the orchids had been grown, not picked, by a man in Hawaii who named his plants. Owen served 3 slices, careful with the angle of the knife. For a few minutes in that empty room, nobody mentioned the 40 chairs, and the room itself seemed to soften around the edges. When Owen stood to go, he paused at the side of her wheelchair and crouched without asking permission. He pulled a small multi-tool from his jacket pocket and examined the locking mechanism on the left rear wheel, with the focused attention of a person who had learned to read mechanical problems the way other people read faces. The lock had been installed at the wrong angle, not dramatically or visibly, but enough to redirect a portion of the load onto Celeste's wrists, with every position adjustment. A subtle but cumulative stress that would worsen on inclines and grow into tendon strain over months of daily use. He made 3 small corrections, tested the mechanism twice, and stood back up. Avery watched her father work from her seat at the table, her chin propped on her palm, the way she watched him in the workshop on Saturday mornings. She had learned a long time ago not to interrupt. When his face went into that quiet, listening shape, she picked up her glass of water and waited. Celeste told him flatly that the chair was a prototype produced by her own company's engineering division, designed by a team with more combined credentials than he was likely to have encountered in one room. Owen said he did not doubt it. He added that the team appeared to have placed the locking bracket roughly 2.5 degrees off true north, and that he could tell because he had spent 11 years designing load-bearing systems before he had stopped. He said it without challenge, the way a man might note the weather. Celeste looked at him for a long moment before she asked what had made him stop. He answered briefly, the way he answered most personal questions. His wife had died. His daughter had needed him in ways that did not fit around a corporate schedule. He had found the work he did now more honest. He did not explain further, and Celeste did not press, but she filed the information somewhere that mattered. She also noted that he had not used the word loss, he had used the word needed, and the difference said something about how he had decided to carry it. He gathered his tools. He took Avery's hand. They walked out together through the same warped oak door he had come in to repair, and the door swung closed behind them with the clean, soft thud of a fix that had finally settled into true. Celeste sat alone for another 20 minutes, looking at the 2 pulled-out chairs across from her, and the 3 plates with their thin trace of lemon curd along the rims, and she did not, for the first time in a long time, feel that solitude as a verdict. She felt it, instead, the way she felt the quiet of her office after a long board meeting, as a space she could think inside. She had been treated, for the length of one slice of cake, as a person whose company a stranger had chosen to keep. That night, after she returned to her penthouse and let her assistant help her transfer from the chair, Celeste's phone lit with a message from an unknown number. She read it twice before her expression went still. Tonight's party was only the beginning. Resign before everyone else walks away too. She set the phone face down on the marble counter. 18 months of reading silences across boardroom tables had taught her how to recognize a coordinated act when she saw one. 40 absences on her birthday had not been a scheduling accident. They had been a campaign. Someone had just confirmed they were watching every move she made, and someone had decided she should know it. She did not call her security team. She did not call her lawyer. She sat, with the phone, face down, and let the truth of the evening settle into the shape it had actually had all along. By morning, she knew the rest. A quiet conversation with her assistant, conducted in the foyer of the company's executive floor before the lights had come up across the open work areas, revealed the truth. Every guest on the evening's list had received an email notification informing them the dinner had been canceled at her personal request. The message had been sent from her assistant's company account at a time when her assistant was documented as having been across town at a vendor meeting. The assistant denied sending the message with a conviction Celeste believed immediately because she recognized the architecture of the action. She had seen the same hand at work in every quiet correction that had been made to her authority over the past 18 months. Someone with access to the company's internal systems had decided that Celeste's birthday would end in isolation and had made sure of it. The 40 empty chairs had not been chance. They had been an instruction delivered to 40 people who had decided that obeying a fraudulent cancellation email was easier than asking the woman they had been invited to celebrate whether the invitation still stood. Not one of them had picked up the phone to confirm. Celeste noted that too, and she did not let it go. She called Owen from her car. She offered him a contract to evaluate the mobility prototype, framing it as a professional engagement with a documented scope and a rate she named directly. He declined. He said he was a craftsman who restored furniture, and the world she moved in was not his. Celeste said that was precisely why she was asking. The world she moved in had given her a defective product and 40 empty chairs, and she was not offering charity. She was offering work. She was offering the kind of work that would not be done if the man who could see what was wrong refused to walk through the door. The pause on his end of the line was long enough that she began to think she had misjudged him. Then he asked what time she needed him at the office, and she said 8. And the conversation ended. Avery had been listening from the passenger seat of his truck and asked, after he hung up, whether the woman from the cake table was going to be okay. Owen said he did not know yet. Avery nodded with the same grave consideration she gave to a tree she had decided needed pruning and went back to her library book. When Owen stepped off the elevator the following morning and walked toward the research division with Celeste beside him, Everett Kingsley was standing at the far end of the corridor, 36 years old, in a tailored charcoal suit that had been cut by someone who understood his shoulders. He watched their approach with the patient expression of a man recalculating odds on something he had previously considered settled. His eyes traveled from Owen's work boots up to the faded denim shirt and back to his face. He did not move from where he was standing. He waited until they were within 10 feet of him before he allowed his expression to shift into something resembling welcome, and even then, the welcome was directed at Celeste and not at the man walking beside her. He turned to Veronica Ashford, standing 2 steps behind him in a cream blazer, and asked in a voice pitched low enough for only her to hear, "Who exactly did she bring up to the floor with the proprietary technology?" The question was not about identity. It was about the fact that Celeste had broken his quiet expectation of what kind of person was permitted to stand beside her, and the question carried the weight of a man who believed that expectation had been an unspoken policy of the building. The research laboratory occupied the east wing of the 12th floor, a clean and pressurized space where a team of 12 engineers had spent the better part of 3 years developing the company's most advanced mobility product. A smart wheelchair system using adaptive sensors and predictive algorithms to adjust balance, resistance, and navigation response in real time. It was scheduled to be presented to a room full of investors and healthcare partners in 11 days. Owen did not introduce himself. He asked, simply, to watch Celeste navigate the prototype across the test surfaces, the smooth floor, the transition strip, the gentle ramp built into the test zone. He observed for 20 minutes, hands behind his back, the focus on his face, the kind that quiets a room without trying to. The lead engineer, a Stanford-trained specialist named Henley, hovered nearby and offered to walk him through the technical documentation. Owen thanked him politely and said he would prefer to read the documents in their original order. Then he asked to see the design files that had existed before the revision cycle, completed 6 weeks earlier. A junior engineer pulled the files without a word. The 12 engineers in the room gradually stopped, pretending not to watch, as Owen set the 2 versions side by side and cross-referenced sensor placement diagrams with hardware specifications and testing logs with the methodical attention of a person who had learned never to rush a conclusion. When he finished, he listed 3 issues. The wheel lock mounting had been repositioned from the original specification by a margin that shifted lateral force distribution onto the user's arms on uneven terrain. The balance sensors had been recalibrated to prioritize performance metrics recorded under ideal conditions rather than the variable surfaces actual users encountered daily, and the central control logic had been weighted towards smooth, impressive performance in a demonstration room at the expense of reliable function in ordinary life. These 3 changes had not existed in the original design. Someone had altered the product specifications within the 6-week window between the final design review and the current build, and the alterations were not the kind of accumulated drift that came from iterative testing. They were deliberate choices that moved the product away from user safety. Celeste asked her lead engineer to pull the revision history, and the engineer reported, with visible discomfort, that the access logs for that period had been deleted, not archived, not encrypted, removed entirely. Everett appeared in the doorway 40 minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the measured expression of a man who had learned to enter rooms in a way that suggested he belonged everywhere. He was gracious with Owen for several minutes, asked polite questions about his background. Then, in the presence of the full engineering team, he turned to Celeste with a reasonable smile. "What was the vetting process for an outside consultant we have allowed access to proprietary technology?" he asked. He paused half a beat. "Are we sure his engineering license is still current?" He pressed lightly on the words outside consultant, just lightly enough that every person in the room understood Owen was being reclassified, in real time, from invited specialist to unauthorized intruder. Celeste met Everett's gaze without moving and asked him to leave the room. After he was gone, Owen told Celeste quietly that he had not agreed to come in order to be deployed in a family dispute. His interest was limited to the fact that a flawed product reaching the market would cause physical harm to people who depended on mobility equipment to function safely in their daily lives. Celeste looked at him for a long moment, then said that after the accident, everyone around her had begun speaking more slowly, choosing simpler words, carrying expressions that communicated more sympathy than belief, as though the failure of her spine had somehow transferred to her mind. She had spent 18 months trying to prove otherwise, which was exhausting in a way she had not admitted to anyone. Owen said, "You don't need to prove you're still a person to anyone in this room." Something in the distance between them changed after that, though neither of them named it. That night, Owen returned home to find a plain white envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of his pickup truck. Inside was a photograph of him and Avery leaving the Halston Grand the previous evening, and below it, a single typed line. "Stay away from Celeste Kingsley, or your daughter will pay for your curiosity." He stood in the driveway with the envelope in his hand, and did not move for a long time. Through the front window, he could see Avery on the couch with her legs tucked under her, reading a library book about ocean animals. She had her thumb pressed against the corner of the page, the way she did when she was getting near the end of a chapter she did not want to finish. He thought about Annika, his wife, and the morning she had collapsed in their kitchen, with the early signs of a complication she had named twice to her doctors, and been told twice not to worry about. He thought about how the emergency room had taken 37 minutes to admit her after he had told them she was in distress, how the attending physician had looked past him to address a white nurse instead, how the chart had recorded her pain as exaggerated until the moment it was no longer survivable. He had sworn, the day he buried her, that he would never let Avery grow up inside a story where a life was weighed differently because of the color of the skin holding it. The envelope in his hand was the first time in 5 years that story had pushed itself back through his front door. He understood, standing there in the cooling dusk, that the only way to keep Avery out of it was to step out of the room himself. He did not sleep that night. In the morning, he returned the access badge to the front desk before business hours began. He left a brief message with Celeste's assistant, saying only that the engagement was not a fit, and drove home. He told himself it was clean. It was not. Celeste called before he reached the end of the block. She said she knew he was lying, not because she had information he did not, but because she had been watching people lie to her face since her wheelchair became the first thing they noticed when she entered a room, and she recognized the particular quality of a lie told by someone trying to protect rather than deceive. Owen said only that he had a daughter to think about. After a long pause, he told her about the photograph. The silence that followed was different from the silences she had encountered before. It was not the controlled quiet of a composed woman deciding how to respond. It was the stillness of someone who had received information she had been half expecting and had not wanted confirmed. She offered him a security detail for Avery, 2 people, discreet, positioned to look like nothing at all. Owen refused. He said that Avery was 8 years old, that she was going to go to school and come home and live her life without knowing she had been photographed as a warning, because the moment she knew, the fear would start, and he had watched fear reshape a person before. She turned to the one thing she could do with precision. She pulled up the building security footage from the night of her birthday and found the gap at 8:43 in the evening, 7 minutes of corrupted footage in the corridor, connecting the private dining suite to the administrative wing, long enough for someone who knew the building well to access her assistant's workstation without being recorded. She cross-referenced the maintenance log for the security system. The disruption had been approved through the facility's management portal under an administrative account. The account belonged to Veronica Ashford. Her closest friend had not simply chosen to be absent. She had personally cleared the path for the attack. Celeste called Veronica directly, not through an assistant, not from a company line, and asked simply whether she had authorized the camera disruption. Veronica did not deny it. She said it had been a measure of assessment. The board had been watching closely since the accident, and Celeste's association with an unvetted outsider was precisely the kind of evidence that would be used against her at the governance review scheduled for the following week. When Celeste asked who had initiated the review, Veronica said the formal request had come from Everett and that it had already collected enough supporting signatures to proceed, regardless of what Celeste could refute in the time remaining. Before she ended the call, Veronica said, in the tone of someone delivering a fact rather than a threat, "The accident took your legs. This vote is going to take the rest of your name." Celeste set the phone down and allowed herself, for the first time in 18 months, to consider the possibility that the accident had been anything other than mechanical failure. The police report had been thorough. The insurance investigation had concurred. The sensor defect that caused her car's stability system to fail on the wet expressway had been attributed to a manufacturing variance, documented In a limited recall affecting several hundred vehicles, she had read the report 4 times, met with the investigators, and accepted the conclusion, because the alternative, that someone close to her had known the risk and done nothing, was a thought she had not been ready to hold. 18 months earlier, in the 2 weeks before the crash, she and Everett had argued sharply over a proposed acquisition. A mid-sized component supplier called Vestrum Dynamics had been quietly brought to the board's attention by Everett, framed as a strategic opportunity to bring key manufacturing in-house and reduce supply chain exposure. Celeste had reviewed Vestrum's safety compliance record and found 3 unresolved notices from federal regulators, 2 of which related to sensor calibration failures in their output components. She had blocked the acquisition in the preliminary vote. The accident occurred 9 days later. She had not connected these events because grief and recovery do not leave room for pattern recognition, and because the people she had trusted most had been standing in her hospital room telling her how lucky she was to be alive. She was ready now. She drove to Owen's workshop that afternoon, without calling ahead. The building was a converted brick warehouse, on the edge of an industrial corridor. Smelling of walnut shavings and warm linseed oil, she found him planing the edge of a long panel and told him everything: the timing, the acquisition, the component supplier, the sensor type that had failed in her car. Owen set down his tools and listened the way he worked, carefully and without rushing the conclusion. He said he was not yet able to tell her that the coincidence meant what she thought it meant, and that she needed something stronger than timeline alignment before she brought it anywhere. Then he agreed to help, because the alternative was leaving her to carry it alone, and because he had already spent enough nights thinking about the photograph under his windshield wiper to know that distance from this woman's life was not actually available to him anymore. Avery came home from school during the 2nd hour. She walked straight to Celeste, set her red backpack down beside the wheelchair, and wrapped her arms around her neck, as though they had done this 100 times. Celeste felt the small weight settle against her, the warmth of a child who had not yet learned to be careful with adults, and for the first time, she understood why Owen had chosen to step back when the photograph appeared under his windshield wiper. A man who had been handed that envelope and gone home to this child had made the only decision a parent could make, and she did not hold it against him anymore. They spent the next 2 days going through records Celeste had stored on a personal device she had never connected to the company network. Owen found the code signature in the calibration parameters of the balance sensors used in the prototype. He found it in 3 places: the sensor firmware itself, the calibration specification in the Vestrum Dynamics product catalog, and a procurement memo in which Everett had pressed for expedited approval of the supplier relationship before Celeste's review was complete. The picture was not complete enough to prove that Everett had caused the accident. What it showed was that Everett had received safety compliance documents predating the crash by 6 weeks, had been informed of the sensor risk, had continued to advocate for the acquisition, and had said nothing to the woman driving a vehicle that contained a component from a flagged batch. Owen said it plainly. Everett had not pulled a wire, had not caused a brake failure, had not cut a cable. What he had done was make a calculation about whose life was worth more than his profit margin, and Celeste had been on the wrong side of it. That evening, a notification from Graham Wexler's office appeared on her phone. The governance review had been moved to 7 the following morning, 48 hours ahead of schedule. Everett knew she was looking. The boardroom of Kingsley Mobility Group was a room designed to communicate permanence. Dark wood paneling, 12 leather chairs around a custom-built table, the family name etched into the glass above the main entrance. By 7:15 in the morning, every seat was filled. Major shareholders, independent directors, 2 outside legal advisors retained by Everett, Graham Wexler at the head of the table, wearing the expression of a man who had convinced himself that what he was about to do was institutional responsibility rather than personal preference. Everett's presentation was methodical and unhurried. He presented 4 lines of evidence. First, the prototype's documented defects, attributed to a breakdown in oversight during Celeste's tenure. Second, a chart of the company's stock performance since the accident, which he framed as a reflection of investor confidence. Third, the decision to introduce an external consultant to a restricted access research environment without a formal vetting process. And fourth, a summary he described as a pattern of emotionally driven decision-making following her return to the office. Veronica then distributed a folder containing photographs taken at a distance in the Halston Grand's private dining room. Celeste and Owen sharing cake. The image cropped to emphasize its informality, alongside a caption noting that the individual pictured had accessed proprietary technology within 72 hours of their first meeting. One of the older board members leaned forward and asked casually whether the consultant's engineering license was still current. Everett answered for him. It had lapsed several years prior. Celeste did not rebut the presentation point by point. She introduced Owen to the room and said plainly that he was the person who had identified a deliberate manipulation of the company's most important product before it reached 200 investors and a market of patients who depended on mobility equipment to function safely in their daily lives. Owen stood. He did not defend his credentials. He walked the board through the original design documents, the altered version, the 3 technical deviations, and the deletion of the access log. He noted that the modifications had been made within a 6-week window in which only senior personnel with level 4 clearance had been active in that directory. He did not say Everett's name. He showed the access tier and let the room read the document. Graham asked Owen directly whether he stood behind the technical findings. Owen said he stood behind the evidence and that the board was welcome to have the documents independently reviewed by any credentialed party it chose, but that the review would reach the same conclusion because the data said what it said, regardless of who was holding the pointer. Everett said the evidence proved nothing about intent, and that the governance question before the board specifically concerned Celeste's leadership fitness, which had not been resolved. Graham acknowledged it and called the vote. The result was even, 8-8, with Veronica Ashford holding the last ballot. Veronica looked at Celeste across the length of the table, took a breath, and voted to remove her. Celeste left the building through the front entrance. There was a cluster of journalists on the lower steps, already there, already briefed. Someone had tipped them, because a removal this clean required a narrative already in place. And Celeste moved through them without stopping, her chin level, her expression giving them nothing that could be cropped and used as a caption about fragility or defeat. She would not take the service entrance. She would not be escorted out through a side garage. She had built 27 years of her professional life in this building, and she would leave it the way she had entered it, through the front door, in full view. By early afternoon, Everett had been named acting CEO. His first announcement was the suspension of the Smart Wheelchair project, pending a management review, framed by the internal communications team as a prudent reassessment of the company's technology roadmap. His second was a restructuring of the engineering division that resulted, by close of business, in the termination of 6 engineers, all of whom had been documented supporters of Celeste's return after the accident. His third was that Kingsley Mobility intended to proceed with the Vestrum Dynamics acquisition at an accelerated pace, which Everett described as positioning the company competitively for the next decade. Owen did not bring flowers or offer speeches about resilience. He called and said he was going to be in the workshop for the rest of the afternoon, and that she was welcome to come, and then said nothing more and waited for her to decide. She came. She drove herself, alone, the way she had begun doing everything else. He had cleared a long workbench and placed on it the materials for a project he had been thinking about since the evening at the restaurant. A chair designed for someone whose upper body did the work most chairs assumed would be distributed through the legs, not a medical device labeled with the vocabulary of limitation, but a well-made, well-considered piece of furniture built for a specific person's actual body. He told her he did not know how to design the seat geometry properly without her input, because he was a craftsman and not an ergonomic engineer, and the design would be better with her in it. They worked on it for 3 hours. Avery sat at the end of the workbench with a pad of sketching paper, drawing the chair from 3 angles, and at one point she looked up and asked Celeste whether she wanted it painted the same blue as her bicycle. Celeste laughed. For the first time in 3 days, and said blue would be fine. Avery nodded with the solemn satisfaction of a project director whose proposal had been approved, and went back to shading the seat with the side of her pencil. When the workshop kettle whistled, Owen poured tea into 3 mismatched ceramic mugs, set one down beside Celeste without asking how she took it, and went back to measuring the angle of the armrest. Somewhere between the 2nd hour and the 3rd, Celeste realized she had not thought about the board vote for almost 40 minutes. That same afternoon, Owen traced the corporate structure of Vestrum Dynamics through public registration documents. The acquisition would route a substantial portion of the transaction value through a holding vehicle called Ashford Strategic Holdings, registered in Delaware, with a beneficial ownership structure that led through 2 intermediate entities to a family trust Veronica Ashford had established 4 years prior. Veronica had not cast the deciding vote as a favor to Everett. She had cast it as a financial partner with a material interest in the acquisition that she had never disclosed to the board. That evening, Veronica called Celeste from a number she did not recognize and said, "If you want to know what really happened to your car, come alone." The meeting was at the Halston Grand, in the same private dining room where 40 chairs had stood empty 3 weeks earlier. Veronica was already there, seated at the window without a drink. She had authorized the camera disruption. She had helped Everett build the case that Celeste's judgment had been compromised. She had been promised a position in the restructured company, and within the past 72 hours had understood that Everett intended to leave her exposed as the sole architect of Celeste's removal. None of that was the part that mattered most. 7 days before the accident, Everett had received a safety compliance report from Vestrum Dynamics, identifying a calibration failure in a sensor component across several production batches, including the batch that had supplied Celeste's vehicle. He had not transmitted it to regulators. He had not told Celeste. He had held the information for 7 days because the recall would have killed the deal. Veronica had kept the original forwarded email with Everett's name on the recipient line and a timestamp 7 days before the crash. She handed it over and agreed to appear before the board. 3 days later, at Everett's acquisition signing, Celeste, Owen, Veronica, and 2 independent attorneys walked in, and the room went quiet. Graham read the email, traced the Ashford Strategic Holdings ownership chain, suspended Everett, and canceled the signing. Everett told Celeste she had staged everything to reclaim power. Celeste answered that she had not come to take back the chair. She had come to make sure he did not get to keep sitting in it. The board voted to restore her position before the day ended. She declined and returned the next morning with 3 conditions: an independent safety oversight committee with halt authority, a standing user advisory group embedded from earliest design stage, and a mandatory third-party safety audit for every acquisition. The board accepted. Then they asked her back as CEO, and she said yes. Everett faced 3 federal counts. Veronica cooperated and resigned. 1 year later, Celeste turned 39. She did not rent a room for 40. She asked Owen to choose the venue, and her only requirement was that it be small and real. He chose the workshop, now a shared design studio. Avery, 9 years old, wore a blue sweater the color of her bicycle. At the center stood 2 chairs Owen had brought back from the Halston Grand that first night, the cracked leg rebuilt with a mortise and tenon joint cut from matching walnut. They did not look repaired. They looked as though they had always been exactly what they were. She arrived early and found him beside them. Avery pulled the left chair out for Celeste, the way her father had the first time. Celeste settled in and put her hand on the armrest of the one beside her before Owen could take it. She told him that what he had done that first night was remind her that choosing to stay beside someone when every easier option was available could be its own kind of door. Owen looked at her, at the room, at the restored chairs, and asked, quietly, "Can I keep sitting beside you?" Celeste answered, "This seat has always been yours." The room once set for 40 and holding no one now held exactly the people who had chosen to be there, and at the center of it, 2 chairs that had stood empty were occupied at last.